Hello, Shmoji here. In this video, we're going to be creating reusable modals in React.js. The reason I wanted to make this is because I looked up for videos on making modals in React, and all of the ones I could find were not reusable, and the code wasn't very clean. So that'll be the difference in this video. We're going to be making reusable modals. This will also be different because you can integrate this right into a large project with no problem. Maybe that doesn't make sense at the moment, so let's get started and I'll explain along the way. If you want copy and pastable code, I will leave the link to the blog version of the tutorial in the description, and in it you'll just have kind of like step-by-step pieces of code. So in this blog tutorial, some of it is split up, but you will be able to find all the code that is needed. For a lot of this code, I'm actually just going to take the already created code here and copy and paste it in. If I feel there's no usefulness in typing it all out, that would probably just waste time. But let me know if you think it'd be better for me to type everything out. Okay, so first things first, I'm just going to take this, which is how you start the project. I'm going to go to my terminal, and this is all you do to create a React project. Now I'm just going to go into the directory, and I use Visual Studio Code, so just do code space dot, and that will open up Visual Studio Code. It opened it in the other screen. Here we go. Just like with most tutorials I make, the first thing that we need is Bootstrap so that we can get a few styles. We don't need these styles, but it makes things a lot easier so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So you can either go back to that terminal we just had, or you can open the terminal in Visual Studio Code and just say npm install bootstrap. Now you want to go into source, open up index.js, go to the blog tutorial, and copy and paste this in. I don't know why, sometimes these things don't come out right, so you can just kind of replace those with what they should be. Something to do with medium that makes them come out wrong. Cool, now you have Bootstrap. So next what you should do is create a folder inside of the source folder, call it modules, create another folder inside of modules, call it modals, and yet again, create another folder inside of modals and call it components. And then create a file inside of components and call it modal.js. Again, I'm just pasting code from the blog tutorial. I won't do this for all the code, but certain pieces I will. So I'm pasting that in. I'm actually doing this so that there's more time to explain the code rather than typing it all out. And I'm also just not very good at talking while I code. So this is a functional component called modal. Takes in props, and there's 3 divs, and then stuff nested inside of it. So all of those are Bootstrap styles, like all these modal selectors here, and they just make your modals look nice. They style it for you. You don't have to write the styles yourself because Bootstrap provides all these. I'm not sure why this one's here. I don't even know if that's totally necessary. You can experiment and try taking it out, but maybe it's necessary. I'm not sure. So you're going to see a lot of these Bootstrap styles throughout this tutorial. I will not explain any of them because they're simply Bootstrap styles that give you the styles that you want. If you're ever confused about them, you can literally just go to Google and type in Bootstrap modal, and it'll tell you, you'll see exactly where all these come from. So really, the most confusing part about this file is this right here, the props.children. But it's more confusing to a beginner. It's actually pretty simple what this does. So later on, don't actually type this part, but later on when we're using our modal component, we'll use it something like this. We'll say modal and then do that. And typically, whatever you put inside, like whatever you nest inside of the modal component, this would not show up. However, you can use this syntax, props.children, and it will put anything that's inside of your component, and it will put it right here. And you could move this, like if you wanted this to show up like here instead, you could do that too. But we're putting ours here. So that's all that props.children does. Okay, so these next components are super simple, and all of them aren't actually necessary, but it's going to make the modals very customizable when you're going to actually create a modal. So I will continue on and you'll see what I mean. First thing, go to components and create a new file, call it modalbody.js. I will get that code and paste it in. It's very similar, just on a functional component called modalbody. Takes that bootstrap style and it passes in the nested DOM elements and passes it in right here. So that's pretty much exactly the same as modal.js. And then next we can create another component. We'll call it modal header.js, and we're gonna do pretty much the same thing. So paste that in and you see same structure. Super simple structure, and we're just breaking it out into components so that when we create custom modals, they will be very customizable. And then one last easy one, we're going to call it modal footer.js, and we will do the same thing, copy and paste, and I'm just going to go ahead and save all that. Okay, so this next stuff is going to be a little bit more complicated. So create a folder inside of modals and call it services. Create a file inside of there and call it modal service.js. So typically I create services whenever I need some way of abstracting logic away, and the service acts as an interface to that logic. Companies will often do this for third-party libraries. This is because if you abstract the library away and create your own service methods for accessing the library, if the creators of that library discontinue it, then you can simply replace the logic with a different library, but the service interface you created stays the same, so you don't have to go all over your application changing the way that you use that logic. So in this case, the modal service will allow us to open modals anywhere we want with one easy method. Okay, so I'm going to copy, paste. So here we have an object called Modal Service. Inside this object are two functions. One's called on, the other one's called open. Let's start with this one. It takes two arguments, event and callback, and what it does is on the document, which is like a I don't know exactly how to explain this. Document, it's a variable that's available throughout like your entire application. It basically gives you access to certain useful functions. So for example, here we're using add event listener, and it takes some event and it adds it based on the name. This is going to be a string. It's actually always, in this case, it's always going to be a string called open. And then the second argument is a function with a callback, and it's passing in e.detail. So in terms of this function alone, that's a bit confusing, but if you look at our second function, open, you see that whenever a modal is opened, it's dispatching a new event called open, and this is the values that it is passing. So later on, we're going to have a central point called the Modal Root. This is where we will listen for modal events, and the way you listen for modal events is use this on function, and the way you send modal events is using this open function. And you see here, with our open event, we are sending a component and props. And this right here is just making sure that that data goes through correctly. So I created a tutorial for this in Vue, and they have their event system built into the Vue framework, and it's so much easier. This is a little bit more confusing because you have to go and use some JavaScript in order to make the events work correctly. So this one thing I figured out was that this detail key here, it's really important. It's a part of the custom event class, so don't leave that out. Now we need to create the component that will actually listen for open events. But first, let's create the file for the styles that that component will use. So inside of modals, create a new folder and call it styles. That's not how you spell things. Styles. And then create a new file and call it modal root.module.css. Inside of it, we're just going to have one selector. It's going to be pretty simple. Usually I'm hesitant to explain CSS because it's more a thing you experiment with until you figure it out. But I'll give a little bit of explanation. So position fix just means it's going to fix this modal root to a certain part of the screen. And top says we're going to fix it to the top of the screen. Z-index just means if there's anything below the modal, then put the modal on top of it. And this is a width and height. It's got 100 view width and 100 view height. That just makes the modal root the entire width and height of the screen. And then this background color is going to make it so that it focuses on the modal, because it's going to give the background a little bit of color so that it kind of dulls it out. Okay, I'm going to clean this up a bit, so I'm going to save that and just I don't like having a whole bunch of tabs open. I'll leave that one open, close that one. Okay, so now go into the components folder, create a new file, call it modal root.js. This is probably the most complicated file, so hang in there. I'm gonna try my best to explain all of it. Got that pasted in. Okay, so this component is the root where any modals that are opened will be placed into the DOM, and it provides one singular location for that. Instead of having modals all over the place nested in different components, it'll be in one singular location, the modal root. We want your modals appearing at the highest level in the DOM tree as possible, so we will place this in app.js later on. So first thing we do is import stuff. That's pretty simple, just importing things. So this is a functional component, or a function component, whichever one you want to call it. It's called modal root. And the way you store state in a function component is different from a class component. So you use something called useState, which is a React hook. There's a lot to learn about those, so I recommend you research into it if this just kind of goes over your head and you don't understand it. But pretty much the way that this is working is we want to store our modal. So we have to store that using useState. And this creates the modal value, or modal variable, and it gives it a default value of an empty object. And then if you want to set this modal, you will use this function called setModal here. So another thing that we need is we need our modal root component to listen for open events, because otherwise it won't know when to open a modal. So to do this, we use another React hook that is called useEffect. So this is ran anytime the component renders, which could actually be an issue. But there's a way to fix it. So useEffect takes two arguments here, as you see. It takes a function, and then the second argument it takes is an array. So if you provide it an empty array for the second argument, then useEffect will only activate once when this Modal Root component is first created. If you wanted this function right here to run every single time some variable changes, you would put that variable into this array, but we will not be doing that. We only want it to run one single time. And the function that we'll be running is our Modal Service on function. So what this does, we created this earlier, it's listening for an event called open. The event will be sending two pieces of data, component and props. And when we receive that event, what we want to do is set our modal variable using this function. And what we're setting it to is an object. The object has three key value pairs. The first one, component, second one, props, and the third one is a close function. What this close function does is pretty simple. The close function simply calls setModal and sets it to an empty object, making it so that modal will no longer be shown on the screen. It may be confusing how this close function works at the moment since we're defining it right here, but it will make sense when we create our first custom modal. So continuing down, we are taking the modal component that was sent to us through the event. So here it's sent through the event, and then we set it in this value here. So then you can access it using modal.component. And if there is one, then we simply use it. Otherwise, we just make this variable null. And the reason we're doing this is because this is a dynamic component, and it's important that the first letter is capital. It's just kind of a React thing. I also think it looks better with this naming system, aside from just using modal.component. So that's all that's doing, is just getting the modal component. And then the last thing is the template section, which has the DOM elements or React elements that will be actually shown on the screen. So the first thing, it's just a section DOM element. We could have used a div here, but I just decided to use a section. And this right here is a conditional style. So what it's saying is, if there is a component, then use this style that we defined earlier. Otherwise, give it no style. You could also just use this value, like modal component, instead of doing this. And as you see below, that's exactly what we're doing here. So this is a conditional piece of logic. It's saying if there is a modal component, then render this onto the screen. Otherwise, if there isn't, then nothing is rendered. And what this is, it's what we created up here. It's just a dynamic component. So what I mean by that is, later on, anybody could create multiple custom modals. So test modal 1, test modal 2, and they're different components, but they kind of have the same structure, and each one will be sent in through an event right here and put into this variable. So the real name of the component won't be modal component, but this is a dynamic component, and it lets you load the component dynamically. So it doesn't really need to know the name of it. I know in the beginning that kind of confused me a bit, so I wanted to make sure I explain it well. So the next stuff here, this is just taking all the props that were passed through the event, and it's using the spread syntax here to make sure that every single one of those props is passed in to this component. This is also a prop. It's our close function that we created up here, and it's making sure that this component will have access to closing the modal. Now this part, I'm not totally sure why it's necessary, but it's a conditional style again, and what's saying is if there is a modal component, give it a display of block. Otherwise, don't give it any display. It'll default to a display of none. And I just kind of had to experiment with this. Like, for some reason, by default, the modal has a display of none, and it doesn't show up on the screen. So if you want it to show on the screen, you have to do this. I'm not totally sure. It might be like a Bootstrap thing. Might be related to Bootstrap Styles. But yeah, this is needed. Now all we need to do is create a custom modal and open it using a button. So we can kind of just close out that and that. Create a new folder inside of source and call it components. These are just kind of like general components, not related to a module. And inside of that, create a component and call it testmodal.js. So you can take that code in the blog tutorial, paste it in, or you could just, it might be better to like just type it all out. It might help you learn it better, especially if you're in the process of learning React. I would actually recommend you type it out. So this is another function component, and you see we import all of our components here. This is our modal implementation components, and we're going to use these to create a custom modal. And I like the way that we created it here because it's super readable. Like, I honestly kind of find it hard to explain this because it's so simple and readable. You see, we just have a modal, and it has a modal header, modal body, modal footer. You can remove the header and the footer if you wanted to. So we've got all that, and then in our footer we have a button, and on click of the button it calls the close function that we created in Modal Root, and anytime you click that it will close the modal. So that is why we, in Modal Root, that's why we pass this close function as a prop to our dynamic component, because so we can use it on click like we are here. Cool. Now we can go to app.js and actually use our custom modal. But first I would get rid of all this junk here. Don't need any of that. This will probably give us a warning in our console, so I'll just get rid of that too. Alright, so first thing, you just want to make sure you import. You want to import the modal root, modal service, and the test modal. We're going to need one function inside of this component. It's going to be called add modal, and all it does is it uses the modal service to open whatever modal we want. In our case, we've only created one custom modal, and that's test modal. And this is kind of showing off why this modal service is so useful. It abstracts all the logic away, and you can open any modal with one simple line of code. So next you want to put the modal root into the template here, as well as a button that calls the add modal function, which will add the modal right where the modal root is. So this is a little bit weird because typically you wouldn't be using a button in the same component where the modal root is. Typically you'll have a huge application, it'll have all these pages, each page goes to a different route, and then each page has all these different nested components, and then somewhere in one of those nested components is where you'd have a button and you'd be adding modals. So, and then it, like, when you use the modal service from any component to add the modal, it will always put it in app.js or wherever you define your modal root. So this is a little bit weird and counterintuitive having the button here, but it kind of gets the point across. So with that, it should work. So if you save it, go to your terminal and say npm start. So it should open your browser to localhost 3000, and then you have a button here. If you click it, bam, you have a modal. And then if you close it, it's gone. If you'd like to have transitions where it doesn't just show it automatically and close it automatically, you could just Google CSS transitions and it's pretty easy to implement. You can also implement a version where you can have stacking modals. So you could have another button in here and you could open even more modals on top of this, and then You could close all of the modals that are open or close them one by one. And if you're interested in something like that, let me know, and I may make another tutorial for that specifically. But yeah, now you know how to create reusable modals, and you can integrate this into any large project, and it's super easy. If you have any questions or just need help, feel free to comment below and I'll see what I can do. If this video helped you out at all, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.